Puts us in John chapter 6, because last week, if you remember, we went through chapter 5, and chapter 5 kind of revolved around this Sabbath day. Do you remember that? They were in Jerusalem, and Jesus healed somebody on the Sabbath, and they began to question, who is this man that can heal on the Sabbath? And Jesus shows that because he is the Son of God, he has the responsibility and the ability to both give life and to judge on the Sabbath, showing that he too is truly God, which we already knew because we read John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh, right? We already knew that Jesus was claiming throughout this to be God. And so from chapter 5 and the streets of Jerusalem, we jump right into chapter 6, and Jesus isn't in Jerusalem anymore. He's on the north end of the Sea of Galilee. So we don't know how much time has passed between the streets of Jerusalem to the banks of Galilee. We don't know what was going on during that time. What route did he take? We don't know any of that. But we do know that he's on the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. And the sea is also called the Sea of Tiberias. You can see that if you're looking at John chapter 6, where it says sometime after this, we don't know how much time, Jesus crossed to the far shore, that's far north of the Sea of Galilee, and that's also the Sea of Tiberias. That's what it was called during John's time when he wrote this book, which is just a reminder, the city of Tiberias is where Herod Antipas lived. And so it's just a reminder that Jesus isn't running away or retreating from the person who's persecuting, but actually right there in the backyard, in Galilee, in the same region that Herod Antipas lived, and he's sharing the gospel. But just to give you this idea of where they're on the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee, interesting fact, is 13 miles long and 7 miles across, right? Now maybe you get an idea of how big that is, but just for some comparisons, Lake Tahoe is 22 miles long and 12 miles wide. Right? So it's a little bit smaller than what our Lake Tahoe looks like, but still in that same general category. You can get an idea of what the Sea of Galilee is like. In fact, I got to go on a boat on the Sea of Galilee as we went across and we sang songs. And as you get out to the middle of this sea, it gets kind of wavy. There's on the banks, not so bad, but out in the middle, there's some waves. And if I wasn't on a big boat, I would have been afraid, right? And so that's the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus is on the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias, and we're going to learn about two miracles that Jesus performs in this story, right? Two miracles that are going to point. Now, again, John doesn't call them miracles, he calls them signs, and signs reveal something about Jesus, and there are two, maybe three, depending on how you count them. Signs happening in John chapter 6, verse 1 through 24, which is what I'm planning on covering. So we know where Jesus is at. We don't know how long it took him to get there. He's on the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, and there's a great crowd of people. That's verse 2. A great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs that he performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up to the mountainside and he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. So I just want, if you want to get the setting, just like last chapter where John kind of inserts this Sabbath, and it becomes like the main theme of the entire chapter, the Passover becomes a main theme in chapter 6. And he just inserts that. The Jewish Passover is near. This is the second Passover that John talks about. Right? The first one was when he was in Jerusalem and he said, you tear down this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. The temple he was talking about was his body. This is the second Passover that we start to learn about. And Jesus is not in Jerusalem. He's on the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, and the Jewish Passover is near. I want you to kind of see what would be going on for the people of Israel as they began this pilgrimage from wherever they lived to get to Jerusalem, where they would celebrate Passover. In all the synagogues, they would be going through the same story, starting in Exodus chapter 1, right? Although they didn't have verses and chapters, but starting right there in Exodus, they would begin to go through the Exodus story about how these people were in bondage and suffering under Pharaoh and his people, how they were told to make bricks and then make bricks without straw. They would be reading all of these stories as they began to make their pilgrimage. This is what the synagogues would be going through. They would hear about all the plagues, right, that God had sent in order to warn Pharaoh to let my people go. They would have definitely been talking about that last plague, the death of the firstborn, in which they were told to take the lamb, right? Jesus, in the beginning of John chapter 1, is called the Lamb of God who takes away sins. Take the blood of the lamb and put it on the doorpost and the sides of your homes. And the Passover angel would go through, and the people who had the blood of the lamb were kept safe. They would hear about the story of Moses leading them through the desert until they came to the banks of the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army coming after them and Moses extending his staff. They would hear about the people of Israel walking through the Red Sea on dry ground, right? Because God controls the sea. How they made it to the other side. And once the last Israelite foot touched the other side, the waters came back down, and it overcome all of Pharaoh and his army, right? Because God judges by the sea. And they would have been talking about this in every one of their synagogues. They would have been talking about, as Israel walked through the desert, they began to grumble because they didn't have bread or meat. They wanted both. And Moses calls out to God and says, what am I supposed to do? And God rains down bread from heaven. So they would have been going through this story in each of the synagogues of the Passover. And that's the setting. And I just want you to see how the setting of this story is the same as that setting. You have Jesus being followed by a great crowd of people who had witnessed his signs and were following after him. And then Jesus goes on to a mountainside, and he looks down at the people, and he has compassion. This is like, if you're thinking Passover story, this is following along the same thing as that Passover is the people followed God through the desert and began to grumble and say, give us bread. We're hungry, and God gives them bread to eat. And so I just want you to see how Jesus in these miracles is going to fulfill a Passover hope that the people had, right? As they go to Jerusalem, they're studying and learning about the Passover stories, and then Jesus is going to have two signs that point that he is the fulfillment of the Passover hope. And that's going to bring me to my first point, which is Jesus provided bread and fish. Jesus provided bread and fish. If you look with me at verse 5, it says this: when Jesus looked up and he saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? And he asked this only to test them, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each of them to have a bite. Now let's just think about this. Kind of like the people of Israel we were talking about this morning with Ken in his sermon. They had witnessed God do all of these signs, and yet still they grumbled. Now you have Jesus looking down on this assembly or group of people from the mountainside, and Jesus tests and says, where are we going to get food for these people to eat? Now you would think, here's what I would think. I would think that Philip would have said, well, you can do it, Lord. I mean, after all, at this point, Philip, we met him in chapter 1, verse 44, right? We met him there. And we know about Philip that he heard what John the Baptist said, right? And he began to follow. We also know about Philip that he would have seen and been at the wedding banquet when Jesus turned water into wine. He would have been at the temple when he was discussing there. He would have probably heard what he said to Nicodemus. He would have gone with Jesus from Judea through Samaria and talked to the Samaritan woman. He would have seen all of these signs. He would have seen Jesus tell the royal official, go and your son will live. He would have heard that. And he would have been in Jerusalem when Jesus healed the paralytic. This man, Philip, has seen signs just like the people in Israel had seen signs in the past. He should have been able to say something like, Lord, you know, God, if you can turn water into wine, surely you can do this. But he doesn't say that. He says it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each person to have a bite. See, Philip is still thinking natural. And Jesus is trying to pull us from thinking about natural things to heavenly things, right? And I think we get stuck there, kind of in that same thought, where we get just stuck on the physical, always thinking about like how God is going to make this work, right? And I just want to say, we've seen God move in the past, haven't we? like as a church, if we were just to write down all the different ways that God has moved within this church, if you were to go back and read that, you would say, wow, God's done some amazing things in that church. But when you're in that moment, when you're thinking about only the physical, you begin to doubt, how is God really going to, how it would take more than a half a year's wages to feed these people, and even for them to have one bite, right? And the Greek says 200 denarii, which a denarii was kind of the common wage. The common wage at that time was like 1 silver denarius. And the NIV kind of adds that up for you and says a half a year's wages, or all those that time. It would take more than 8 months' wages or half a year's wages for everyone to have at least one bite. So I just want you to see that Philip's thinking naturally, and he should have been thinking something bigger because he's seen the signs, just like the people of Israel has seen God move in the past. He should have been thinking differently, but he's still kind of thinking like Moses. Here's what Moses says in Numbers, by the way. When the people are grumbling against him and he wants food, in Numbers chapter 11, verse 13, he says this, "Where can I get meat for these people? They keep wailing at me," right? Like Moses should have been able to know also that God could provide meat if he wants to. Philip should have been able to know that God could provide something for them to eat if he wants to. But we get so stuck thinking about the natural things, what's right in front of us, and not realizing the power of God. But there's another one of his disciples. In verse 8, it says, "Another disciple, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. 'Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?'" So Andrew to the rescue, right? You know what's cool about Andrew? He's always bringing people to Jesus. That's what Andrew does in John's gospel. I want to read it out of John chapter 1, verse 40. And whenever we see Andrew, starting in verse 40, it says, "Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the first 2 who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, 'We have found the Messiah.'" That's in John's gospel. Andrew's job is to bring people to Jesus. And so it makes perfect sense that Andrew shows up with this boy who has some bread and some fish. But he's still wondering, like, what is God going to be able to do with such a little portion? Have you ever wondered that when maybe you look at the things in your life and you think, what is God going to be able to do with this? Right? It just seems so small, so insignificant. Right? How is God going to be able to make this work? And I don't know what that is. It could be your financial situation. It could be just how you feel about yourself. But whatever it is, how is God going to be able to make this work? But I just want you to know a little bit of bread and a little bit of fish in the hands of Jesus goes a long way, right? You just have to trust that. Because we've seen it already in the past. We've seen how God can take and do amazing things with just a little bit. And that's what Jesus does. It goes on in verse 10. He says, Jesus said, "Have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place." And they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves and gave thanks and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. Isn't that amazing? Like, where did all this bread come from? What happened? And it's that little thing that in the hands of Jesus that goes a really long ways, right? He has the people sit down on the grass, and it's that grass reference to springtime, Passover, right? And he has the people sit down and he distributes it. In John's gospel, it's Jesus distributing it. In the other gospels, it's the disciples helping. I'm pretty sure with 5,000 people, the disciples had to help, right? But it's amazing. Jesus took the bread, gave thanks for the bread, and then distributed the bread. And if we're going back to this Passover idea, right? Because they're in the Passover right there. The Passover's near. If you go back to that, the distribution of bread is a sign of something. It's a sign of this. Exodus chapter 16. Ken went through this morning. In verses 11 through 18, it says, the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you'll be filled with bread. I like that this morning when Ken was talking about that. Like, God heard the grumbling, and he decided to rain down bread, right? That's like, what a great and merciful God. Anyway, it says, then you will know that I am the Lord your God. When you see the bread and you see the meat, then you will know that I am the Lord your God. And what is Jesus distributing in this miracle? Bread and fish. Maybe later on he'll say, like, my flesh, right? He'll start talking about that, but that's for next week, right? We'll get into that next week, where Jesus uses these signs and then kind of explains his Passover meetings for them. But this should be showing us that Jesus is fulfilling the Passover hope that these people, as they go to Jerusalem, looking to wonder, is the Messiah coming? Is he not coming? When can we be looking for him? And here's this man who is giving them bread and meat while they followed him around. Like, if you got to be able to see that Jesus is fulfilling that Passover hope that they had, and they'll see it too. But before we talk about how they see it, because they mess it up, I want to show some more things about how Jesus blesses. It says, when they had all had enough to eat, and said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left, leave nothing to waste. So they gathered them, and they filled 12 baskets with pieces and 5 pieces of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. Like 12 baskets from 5 barley loaves. Are you guys good at math? That's not a problem that should work out, right? It's like if you were to try to show that to your teacher at school, they'd be like, that doesn't work, right? Because it's a miracle, it's a sign. God is distributing, God is giving bread and fish. And not only is he giving it, but you have more now that you're done eating than you had when you even began. And that's the kind of God that we serve, right? One that continues to bless us in ways that we don't expect. And when we take a step back and look at it, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment, we find that God is doing something more amazing than what we even asked for, right? That's how God works. He takes 5 barley loaves, which was the bread of the poor people, and he turns it into 12 basketfuls. One for each of the disciples. At least that's how I would have distributed it. You know, I would have given them all to my disciples. But and Jesus does. He sends them off on the boat. But I just want to show how Jesus is giving bread and fish, and it's pointing to that Passover hope that God will bring someone like Moses who's going to do some of the similar things that Moses has done. And here's Jesus giving bread and fish, and they get it. See, the crowd of people understand what this sign is pointing to. It's going to bring me to my second point. The people want to force Jesus, right? The people try to force Jesus. Here's what happens. After the people saw the sign, this is verse 14, Jesus performed, they begin to say, surely this is a prophet. Now they get it, right? Because Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 18, which we've done a couple times. It's actually Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, which we've talked about a couple times. He's talked about this. A prophet just like me is going to come. He's going to remind you of all the things that I've taught you. They should have been looking forward. In fact, by going to Jerusalem, they're looking forward to a Passover hope. They see Jesus. They follow him around. He provides bread and meat. And then they say, surely this is the prophet. They get it. At least it seems like they get it. They know who he is, but they don't really understand what he's come to do. They want to force him. See, that's verse 15. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come to him and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountainside by himself. They wanted to force him to be something that he wasn't there to be, right? And that idea of forcing is they want to force Jesus to do it. How often do we do that? We understand, and people do this all the time. They understand who Jesus is, but they try to fit him into a mold that he wouldn't come to fit into. Like, if you ever work in the nursery, we have these little toys, they're like a square box, and you're trying to put a circle into a circle and a square into a square, and you know, I can do it no problem, right? Sometimes there's a problem. But the little kids, they struggle with it. You know, they're trying to jam a circle into something that's shaped like a square. And that's what they're doing with Jesus. They understand he's the prophet, just like Moses. All the signs are pointing to it, but they're trying to force him to do what he hadn't come to do. They want to make him king by force. And I think their argument probably sounded something like this. Rome is bad. It's oppressing the people. Herod is a puppet king, right, for Rome. And he's oppressing the people. Surely Jesus is, if he's the prophet that they talked about, surely this is the problem he came to face, right? Surely that's what he's coming to do. Let's make him king by force. See, we do the same thing. Like we know who Jesus is, but we try to force him into the problems we believe he came to take care of. The problems that we see in our world, and we say, surely this is the problem Jesus wants to take care of. And I'm sure that that is the case. I'm sure some of these problems that we point at, Jesus does want to take care of it, but maybe not in the way that you think it should be done. In fact, he did take care of Rome. He did, go after that, maybe you want to call it beast, but he did it through offering himself on a cross. Not the way that you thought. Not a kingdom like you thought, because his kingdom is not of this world, right? And so the people try to force Jesus. They know who he is, but instead of accepting him on his own terms, they try to force him into theirs. And we'll see again later that they want to come after Jesus, but only for what they want, not necessarily what he's come to give. So that's my second point, is the people want to force Jesus. And when you try to force Jesus, when you try to exploit him to make him like a military Messiah, he's just going to walk away. And that's what Jesus does. Verse 15 says, Jesus, knowing that they had intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountainside by himself. He didn't come to be Judas Maccabeus. He came to be Jesus, right? And we have to understand that. So my third point, we've got Jesus gave bread and fish. They tried to force Jesus to be king. And now the third point is Jesus calms the water. Now, in order for us to understand how this also is going to be Jesus fulfilling a Passover hope, let's go back to the Passover, right? In the synagogues, they would be hearing about the death angel, the death of the firstborn, how they went into the desert, and then God did what to the sea? He split it. And he judged through the sea. Right? Because when they made it through on dry land, God brought the waters back together. See, Israelite people, they understand, the Jews, they understand that the sea is like this love-hate relationship. See, God delivers people, but he also judges. Noah's on the ark, he's safe. The rest of the world, they're in trouble because of the sea. Pharaoh's army, they're in trouble because of the sea. But Israel makes it through on dry land. Like that's the understanding that they have of the sea. God is both delivering and judging, and so they just stay away from it. Jonah learned that, right? God judged and delivered Jonah from the sea as well. But they understand that God controls the waters. I want to show you how this works in Psalm chapter 107. It's like this poetic way, I think, to maybe make the point. Here's what it says. Psalms 107, verse 25 through 30. It says this. For he spoke and he stirred up the tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and they staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for all mankind. See, God controls the waters. And then Jesus tells his disciples during the evening, which doesn't seem like a bright idea, when it's dark, get into your boat and go to the other side of the sea. See, that happens in verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake where they got into the boat and they set off across the sea to Capernaum. By now it was dark and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on water, and they were frightened. And I just want to point out, you would be too. Like, let's just think about this miracle. It's dark outside, right? Like the Sea of Galilee is like I said, it's a little bit smaller than Lake Tahoe. You know, it's 13 miles by 7 miles across, a little bit smaller than Lake Tahoe, but it has larger storms because you have a desert on the east side, and on the other side you have this mountain range that blows cool air into the valley, into the sea. And so the cool mountain air hits the hot desert air, and it causes big storms, right? And so although the sea itself is smaller, the waves are a lot bigger. And it's dark outside. Now, if waves and a dark boat isn't scary enough, like the only light you have is whatever is like breaking through the clouds from the moon, which isn't very bright either, right? But now with your eyes adjusted a little bit, you look out and there's this man walking on the water. Like it says they're frightened, and I'm thinking that's definitely true. They like the wave brings the boat up and you see him, and then down and now you don't, and up and you see him and down now you don't, and so you're just questioning the whole time. Did you see that? What is that over there? And then Peter's like, "Stop! Shut up! Keep rowing." You know, they're 3 miles into this. They're tired, and there's Jesus walking on the water, and they were frightened. I would be frightened too, but Jesus says to them in verse 20, he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." That's a weird way to say that no matter what language you're in, right? Like in English, we might say, "Hey, it's me," right? In Greek, it doesn't make a lot of sense either, because Jesus is beginning these I statements. He began the first one in John chapter 4, verse 26. I, the one you're talking to, I am he. And then in Greek, the he isn't even actually there. We just put it in there so the sentence makes sense. And now in this text, he's saying, don't be afraid, it's I. Also another reference back to that Passover story where God tells Moses from the bush, the one who is sending you, I am. And he's saying, don't be afraid. Because the one that walks on the water is the one that can control the water. Right? He's the one that both delivers and judges. He has control of the water. And when they recognize that, they're no longer afraid. So verse 21, when they were willing to take him on the boat. And immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So I said 2 miracles. Do you guys see 3? I see 1. You turn bread into lots of bread, right? I see 2. You walk on the water. And I see 3. Immediately you're on the other side. Like, how amazing is that? You're out there in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, you know, although he's just on the northern tip, but like you're in the middle of that sea. You put Jesus in the boat, and the storm stops, and you're at your location. How great is that? Because God controls the waters, right? We're going to see this. Like Jesus in the next part, he's going to say, "I am the bread." You know, and we see, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. It is I, right? Like Jesus is showing through these signs that he is somebody that they have been looking forward to. He is the Passover hope that they had been anticipating. But they don't get it, or they do get it, and they try to force him into a hole that he doesn't fit, right? They try to exploit him. And in this text, like Jesus leaves, and then the people, right? This is what happens in verse 22. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there. So that's the facts of the case, right? If this was a CSI, here's the facts. Only one boat had been there, and Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but they had gone away alone. So only one boat, Jesus wasn't on it, the disciples left alone. And then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into boats and went to Capernaum in search for Jesus. These people had recognized that a miracle had happened. I don't know what it was, But Jesus isn't around. There was only one boat. Jesus wasn't on it. The disciples aren't here. Where did Jesus go? And they began to go and search for Jesus. And we're going to answer next week, why are they looking for him? Like, first, it was because they want to exploit him and make him king. Why are they looking for him now? And it should cause us to question, I think, why are we looking for Jesus? What is it that we want out of Jesus? Because he comes for a very specific purpose. He comes so that we can have life and to the abundance. But sometimes we try to make Jesus into the great bread giver. Or we want to force him to be king of a natural world. And he's pointing us towards heavenly things. I think in this search for Jesus, the promise is that we'll have life, right? Jesus is the bread of life, the living water. And so if you're looking for life, true life, we're going to invite you to come to Jesus. We're going to